Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, known as SNAPS. My name is Kate Lyons with ICF International, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. Today's webinar is Determining Homeless and At-Risk Status, Income, and Disability. We are lucky to have these national experts presenting today. Ann Oliva is the Director of HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, or SNAPS. She oversees the Continuum of Care programs, HPRP, ESG, BRAC, and Title V programs. Brett Guino has been instrumental in providing assistance in the development of the regulations in support of the HEARTH Act. And we have Susanna Limon, who is a policy analyst in the SNAPS office and has worked with the HUD's homeless programs for 17 years. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour and a half. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be posted on the HUD HRE website at the address on your screen. Next slide, please. Audience, okay, there are approximately 1,007 registrants for today's presentation. As a result of this capacity, attendees may experience a slight delay in the progression of slides. We advise you to print off the slides, which can be found in the hyperlink in the chat box, and follow along using those. All lines will remain muted for the duration of the call. We recommend using your phone to listen in and not your computer speaker. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please request assistance by going to the GoToWebinar toolbar and clicking Questions, and we will get back to you immediately. If you have trouble seeing the presentation, first try logging off, then try logging in again. That can often take care of the problem. If you have tried that but continue to have difficulty, use the GoToWebinar toolbar to the right of the View pane on your screen. Find the dialog box in the Questions pane, and there you can request technical support. Next slide, please. By using the same feature, you may submit content-related questions as well. Our two resource advisors, Susan Ziff and Teresa Silla, will do their best to respond to you directly. Be aware, though, that sometimes we can't answer all of the questions that come in during the webinar. Next slide, please. If you have questions that were not answered during the webinar, please submit them to HUD's Virtual Help Desk at the web address on your screen. The slide includes directions on the appropriate topic and subtopic to use if you are submitting a question about the definitions. However, if you have a question related to eligibility, please direct it to the appropriate program component section on the ESG Help Desk. Next slide, please. What is covered in the webinar? Annual income must be determined and documented for a variety of reasons. This webinar introduces what does and does not count as income, as well as how to annualize wages and periodic payments. We will also briefly discuss assets and how assets are treated under the Part 5, Section 8 definition on income. The definition of disability is included here because the Shelter Plus Care statute states that, to the extent possible, not less than 50% of funds be reserved for homeless individuals who are seriously mentally ill or have chronic problems with alcohol, drugs, or both. Additionally, the Permanent Housing for Homeless programs with disabilities component under SHP can only accept homeless persons with a qualifying disability and their families. As we discuss these three topics, housing status, income, and disability, we will consider the documentation standards associated with each. In general, HUD allows for various types of documentation, but not all documentation is considered equal. HUD has adopted guiding standards for the different types and sources of information. We will present these standards as part of the discussion of each topic. Next slide, please. By the end of this webinar, we want you to be able to describe and apply the housing status, income, and disability definitions. We also want you to be able to understand the documentation standards related to these definitions. Next slide, please. It's important to understand what will not be covered under this webinar. While housing status, income, and disability may be important factors in determining eligibility for assistance under program components, this webinar will not focus on eligibility for assistance. Eligibility requires additional screening for need, appropriate types, and appropriate levels of assistance. Also, income and disability requirements vary by program component. Since we are limited by time, this webinar will focus on the definition of income and disability. Finally, the interim ESG regulations include specific record-keeping requirements for documenting homeless and at-risk of homelessness definitions. However, we are only addressing overall standards and approaches to documentation. A future webinar to be scheduled in early 2012 will delve into specific documentation and record-keeping requirements. And now I'd like to turn it over to Anne.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much to all of you who are joining us today. The first thing that I wanted to mention before we get started, and it's not an invitation for you to get off of the webinar and go check the HRE, but I did want to just let you all know, in case you didn't already know, that the Continuum of Care Renewal Awards were made earlier today. So they are posted on the HRE for you to take a look at. But like I said, you should stay on the line for this very exciting webinar that we're about to provide you. For those of you who were on the line last week and are rejoining us this week, we took quite a bit of the feedback that we got from last week's webinar and have made some changes to it, so it's not exactly the same, and the slides are slightly different. We tried to reorganize it to make it easier for folks to follow along. So as we get started, I wanted to thank you all again for your patience with us as we worked through the development of the 6 program rules that implement the HEARTH Act for the McKinney-Vento programs as amended by the HEARTH Act. And as you can see, the law, in the various rules that you already have access to, the law is complex, and it did take us, some time to work through all of the details through all 6 rules. You now have access to review 4 of the 6 rules that implement the HEARTH Act, and let me lay those out for you. First, the Emergency Solutions Grant rule is available for you. That is the interim rule. Along with that, in the same document, is the amendments to the Consolidated Plan rule, also in interim status, which means that it will be in effect in January. The Homeless Management Information Systems proposed rule, which means it is not in effect, but it is out for public comment, is posted on the HRE. And, of course, the Homeless Definition Rule, which is what we're going to be covering today, that is in final, which means that it has gone through the public comment process, and this is the final rule. As you all are probably keenly aware, this is our first final rule that we're issuing to implement the HEARTH Act. And if you read it, which hopefully you did before joining this webinar, you'll see that we took the comments that we received in the public comment period very seriously, and we made some substantive changes based on those comments. So as you're looking at the ESG, CONPLAN, HMIS, and the upcoming Continuum of Care and rural program rules, I would encourage you to thoughtfully review those rules when they are released and provide us with comments that we can really take into consideration, especially in the places where we ask for public comment. And we do in the preamble, in all of those rules, we ask for public comment on some specific areas where we thought maybe there was going to be some sticky situations. The homeless definition, the HEARTH Act did not actually require that the homeless definition rule be published with a set of documentation requirements. However, we felt that it was important to include them in this rule, and I know that there's some anxiety out there around the documentation requirements. Hopefully, one of the things that we'll do as we get to the end of this presentation is calm some of that anxiety. But we felt that it was important to include them for a couple of reasons. And the first is the law is somewhat complex in that there is an overlap between the definition of at risk of homelessness and the definition of homelessness, and we've never had that kind of overlap before. So there is that particular issue that we felt needed to have some documentation standards applied to it. And the second issue that many of you may or may not know is that documentation of eligibility is really the #1 finding that we have across the board when we do monitoring. That is, it is the #1 reason that we ask people to repay grant money. And we really are trying to be as clear as possible, but also realistic for our grantees, so that you all can understand what we're expecting when we go out and monitoring, and that we don't have to recapture money from any of our programs who are doing good work on the ground. For programs that are supportive housing programs or shelter plus care programs, I think that you'll see, as Susanna walks through the homeless definition, that really the definition itself and the documentation standards are largely not that much different than what you've been doing. But we really wrote them down for the first time, and 2, we're trying to be more specific about what types of documentation you should be keeping in your files. Throughout the presentation, you'll also hear us talk about how we're trying to be realistic and give you clear options for what applies in what kinds of situations in terms of documentation. However, when you're reading regulatory language, as somebody who hasn't been working on it for the last 2 years, the regulatory language does not really lend itself to point out where the gray areas are. And with this presentation today, as well as with the TA materials that we will be putting out around this definition, and the upcoming, other webinars we'll schedule, as well as other types of training, I think it'll be clear to you when you can use different types of documentation standards. So can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So again, we're doing a high-level overview today of the homeless definition, the at-risk definition, as well as some items that are related to both of those things. But we are not specifically talking about eligibility for programs. Those eligibility requirements are in the various program rules or in the NOFA. And I want to address a couple of questions that we received after we did this webinar last week. So let's be crystal clear here about the application of the definition, which is on this slide. Projects funded under the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, which takes effect on January 4th, have these rules will apply to those projects. These rules will also apply to new and renewal projects that are funded in the FY 2011 Continuum of Care competition. So the renewals that we announced today, as well as the new projects that we'll announce in the coming weeks, will be subject to the new homeless definition rule. However, and we got quite a few questions on this before, remember that eligibility for a program, again, is not the same as the homeless definition. That said, in the NOFA, the requirements that are laid out in the NOFA apply to these programs. It's just that the definition of homelessness has changed. That specifically applies to permanent housing projects funded under the Supportive Housing Program and Shelter Plus Care. The NOFA requires that homeless persons served by those programs come from the street, shelter, or transitional housing. So that limitation still applies because it was in the NOFA, and that is how these projects were funded. However, the broader definition of homelessness that takes effect on January 4th also applies to those programs. So hopefully that was clear, and we won't get as many questions on that as we move forward. So with that, I am actually going to turn it over to Susanna Limon, who's going to walk you through some of the definition of homelessness components. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks for joining us for this rebroadcast of our webinar. If you were with us last week, we're especially grateful that you're joining us again for this sequel. For our webinar today, we hope to have very few special effects. And the good news is that you won't need your 3D glasses. Let's hope not anyway. I'm going to talk today about the homeless definition and the 4 categories. We've listed all 4 on this slide, but we'll be going through the details of each category in the next few slides. Now, before we dive into the details, I want you to notice that all 4 categories listed on this slide are included in the homeless definition. Please don't be confused by the fact that some of these households are currently in housing. They, too, are included in the homeless definition. Let me point out that since we'll be discussing many categories in today's presentation, including the categories in the at-risk definition and the categories in the disability definition, I'm going to refer to the slides in these 4 homeless categories as homeless category 1, homeless category 2, homeless category 3, and homeless category 4. Next slide, please. The first category of the homeless definition is specific to individuals and families who are literally homeless. You'll notice that this first category is the one that we've used in the past for our homeless definition. This should be a comfort to all of us. What we have for this category is not new. Basically, you've been using this all along to determine who is literally homeless. There are 3 living circumstances included under this category. This slide talks about persons who are on the street. This includes individuals or families who are sleeping in a place not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation. Let me give you some examples of places that are not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation. These can include a car, a park, an abandoned building, a bus or train station, an airport or camping ground. Next slide, please. Still in the same category, that first category of literally homeless, category 1, we also include persons who are in shelters or transitional housing. In this category, we include individuals or families who are living in a supervised shelter designated to provide temporary living arrangements, and they also meet the definition of literally homeless. Shelters can be publicly or privately operated. Some examples include congregate shelters and transitional housing. We had a lot of questions last week in our webinar regarding transitional housing, so please note that it is included here in the first category, and we've included it on the slide. Now, hotels and motels are also included as temporary shelter when they are paid for by charitable organizations or when they are paid for by federal, state, or local government programs for low-income individuals. Please be aware, however, that hotel or motel rooms that are rented by potential program participants are not included here. Next slide, please. And in the first category of the homeless definition, still looking at the literally homeless, the final living situation includes persons who are in institutions. This means that individuals who are exiting an institution meet the definition of literally homeless if their stay has been 90 days or less and they were sleeping in an emergency shelter or place not meant for human habitation immediately before entering the institution. Let me explain a nuance here. If an individual was residing in transitional housing before they entered the institution, they are not considered homeless. This is because historically, projects funded through SHP or Shelter Plus Care have been allowed to maintain a unit for an individual who is temporarily residing in an institution. HUD intends to continue this policy in the proposed rule for the COC program. That means that these individuals would have a unit to return to and would not be considered homeless. Let me give you a heads up here. We've sprinkled a few quiz questions throughout the webinar, so you just may see some things from this slide in a little bit. That's my hint, hint. I'd like to summarize the last 3 slides that we've talked about. These covered the first category of homelessness, the literally homeless. They included persons who are on the street, persons who are in shelters or transitional housing, and persons who are in institutions. Let's move now to the second category. Next slide, please. Category 2 is the imminent category. Let's do a quick slide check here. I'm on slide 15, and the title of your slide should be Homeless Category 2 Criteria. Great. Households qualify under the second category of homelessness if they will imminently lose their primary nighttime residence. When I say imminent, this means within 14 days. If you remember, we used to say 7 days, but now it is 14 days. Their primary nighttime residence may be housing they own, they rent, or they live in without paying rent or sharing with others, or it can be rooms in hotels or motels that are not paid for by federal, state, or local government programs for low-income individuals or by charitable organizations. Additionally, these individuals or families must have no identified subsequent residence, and they must lack the resources or support networks needed to obtain other permanent housing. So that's it in a nutshell for Category 2. They are going to lose their housing within 14 days. They have no other place to go, and they have no other resources to help them get housing. Next slide, please. Let's talk now about the third category. This is new to our homeless definition, and I'll be covering the points from the rule on this slide and the next one. Category 3 includes persons who qualify as homeless under other federal statutes. The list of the other federal statutes is included in the rule. There are 7 of them. We didn't include it here on the slide because, quite honestly, they wouldn't fit on the slide, but they include programs from the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, and the Justice Department. If an unaccompanied youth who is under 25 or families with children and youth who do not qualify as homeless under Category 1 or Category 2, but do meet the homeless definition under another federal statute, then we're also looking at their housing from the last 60 days, their number of moves in the last 60 days, and whether there are any special needs or barriers, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Before I move on, I want to touch on the second bullet related to housing. In order to qualify, the youth or family can't have lived in permanent housing at any time during the last 60 days. And to quickly touch on the last bullet, the youth or family must have moved 2 or more times in the last 60 days. If you're wanting a little more explanation on each of these bullets, we've provided some detail on how we arrived at these in the preamble of the rule. Next slide, please. To finish up with Category 3, as I mentioned before, in addition to qualifying under another federal statute and not living in permanent housing in the last 60 days and moving 2 or more times in the last 60 days, persons will qualify if they can be expected to continue in the status of homelessness for an extended period of time because of certain special needs or barriers. These can be any of the ones included on the slide, such as chronic disabilities or chronic physical health or mental health conditions. They can also include substance addiction, or it can also include a history of domestic violence or childhood abuse, which can also include neglect. Also, part of these special needs or barriers can be the presence of a child or youth with a disability. Let me point out the last bullet, 2 or more barriers to employment. The list of the barriers is included in the rule. I won't read all of them now, but these are things like lack of high school degree or GED, or history of unstable employment. So this finishes up our third category. Let's talk now about the last category, Category 4. Next slide, please. The fourth category of homelessness is specific to individuals or families who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. This category includes individuals fleeing other dangerous, life-threatening conditions related to violence against the individual or a family member, including a child, that has either taken place within the individual's or family's primary nighttime residence or makes the individual or family afraid to return to their primary nighttime residence. Let me repeat, this category is not just limited to individuals or families fleeing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. It also includes, as part of the definition, individuals and families who are fleeing other dangerous life-threatening conditions that are related to violence against the individual or a family member, including a child, that has either taken place within the individual or family's primary nighttime residence or makes the individual or family afraid to return to their primary nighttime residence. Now, households meet the homeless definition under Category 4 if they have no identified subsequent residence and lack the resources and support networks needed to obtain other permanent housing. When looking at subsequent residence and resources, note here what we are talking about. Support networks include family, friends, faith-based or other social networks. Also, a housing situation that is unsafe due to violence is not considered a resource or support network. Providers must not disqualify an individual or family based on housing or resources that cannot be safely accessed. We've just finished talking about the 4 categories. Just to quickly recap, the first category is the literally homeless, those on streets, those in shelters or transitional housing, and those in institutions. The second category includes those who will imminently lose their housing within 14 days. The third category includes those who meet the definition of homeless in another federal statute. And the last category on this slide is Category 4, those fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. So this is where we're about to get tricky. It's time for a couple of quick questions. I'm going to turn it back to Kate to test our knowledge so far.
Thank you, Susanna. Okay, everyone, please take a minute and look at the quiz question. Mark will be discharged from jail after 4 months. He has no housing options or resources. He meets the criteria for Category 1. Now, is this true or false? We'll give you a few minutes to answer the question. Okay. Justin, there we go. HUD, would you like to, someone from you like to answer this one?
Okay, very good. We had false as the answer here, and 72% of you got it correct, and we're glad to see this result here. We wanted to follow up. We rushed a little bit through the questions last week, and we wanted to spend just a minute on the question if we can. Let's change it around a little bit. If the person had been there for only 2 months, would they be meeting the criteria for Category 1? If that were the case, you'd have to ask the question, where were they before they entered the institution? If they were in transitional housing, they would not meet the criteria. But if they came from the streets or the shelter prior to entering the institution, then yes, they would meet the criteria. And to give you just a couple more examples of institutions, it could include hospitals, mental health facilities, jails. Those are some examples. All right, Kate?
And just to be clear, the reason that this was false was because the time period was too long. It was 4 months, and the time period in Category 1 is 90 days. Okay, Kate?
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we have one more question on the homeless definition. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. Jamie is fleeing dating violence and has no resources or support networks identified. Is Jamie considered homeless under which category? Okay. I don't know how far along we've gotten. Do you think it's time to give them? There we go. Okay. Would someone from HUD like to explain why the answer is Category 4?
Wow. This is an exceptional score. I think 94% of you said it was Category 4, and that's correct. The qualifying thing is fleeing the violence, no resources and support networks. And remember, this is not a new category for HUD. We've been serving persons fleeing domestic violence as part of our homeless definition in the past as well. Congratulations to all of you on these quiz results. And heads up, we will have a couple more quiz questions as we continue through the webinar.
All right. Now we're going to go ahead and start addressing the definition of at risk of homelessness. Next slide, please. Just like the definition of homeless, the definition of at risk of homelessness has been divided into 3 categories. To avoid confusion, we will refer to these as at risk category 1, at risk category 2, and at risk category 3. Category 1 is applicable to individuals and families. Category 2 applies to unaccompanied children and youth. And Category 3 includes children and youth and their families. And we will discuss the details of these over the next few slides. For the purposes of at risk of homelessness, HUD is considering persons under the age of 25 as youth, consistent with our definition of youth in the homeless definition. Next slide, please. The first category of the at risk of homeless definition has 3 areas to consider when determining eligibility. The first criteria is related to income. All households must have incomes below 30% of the area median income. For those of you who are familiar with administering HPRP assistance, you will notice that this is different, but below 30% is the statutory requirement for at risk of homelessness. The second criteria is related to resources and support networks. Intake staff must determine that the potential program participant does not have the resources and support networks to avoid literal homelessness. This means that you are helping them avoid moving into an emergency shelter or another place Susanna described in Category 1 of the homeless definition. The third criteria is related to risk factors associated with homelessness. The 7 risk factors are listed on the next 2 slides. We'll go through those risk factors, but please note households must meet at least one of these risk factors. Next slide, please. The first risk factor includes persons who have moved 2 or more times due to economic reasons in the 60 days immediately preceding the application for homelessness assistance or homelessness prevention assistance. This is consistent with Category 3 of the homeless definition. The second risk factor relates to individuals and families who are living in the home of another because of economic hardship. The third risk factor is that the household will lose housing within 21 days of the date of application for assistance. The fourth risk factor is that the household is living in a hotel or motel where they are bearing the cost of the room. This is what distinguishes the at-risk definition from the definition of homelessness, where a charitable organization or a state, local, or federal program is paying for the hotel or motel room. Next slide, please. The fifth risk factor includes individuals and families that are living in severely overcrowded units, as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. The regulation goes into a bit more detail about what that means. It means a single-room occupancy or efficiency apartment with more than 2 persons, or in larger housing units, more than 1.5 persons per room. It's important to note that in this instance, room includes more than just the bedroom. It includes other living areas as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. The sixth risk factor includes persons who are exiting a publicly funded institution or system of care. For those of you who were wondering what happens to those persons who resided in an institution for more than 90 days, if they had an income below 30% and they lack the resources and support networks, then they would potentially qualify as at risk of homelessness. They would not be considered homeless. The final risk factor is that they live in housing that has been identified in the recipient's consolidated plan as having characteristics associated with instability and an increased risk of homelessness. Unless the consolidated plan for the geographic area in which the project is located includes these characteristics, you may not use this criteria. Next slide, please. The second category of the at-risk of homelessness definition includes unaccompanied children and youth who do not otherwise qualify under the homeless definition or don't qualify under the at-risk of homelessness definition in Category 1, but who are defined as homeless under another federal statute. As with the homeless definition, the complete list of other federal statutes for the purpose of this category are included in the regulation. They are not included on this slide because it would have been much too long. It's important to note that under this category, it is just the child and the youth. It does not include parents or guardians. But if we switch to the next slide, you will see that the third category is children and youth who qualify under the Education for Children and Youth Program, which uses the Department of Education's definition of homelessness, and their guardians are counted as at risk of homelessness if they are not otherwise defined as homeless in our definition. This is the only instance under the at risk of homelessness definition that parents or guardians, if they're living with the child or youth who are defined under other federal statutes as homeless, are included. And this allows our programs to both support reunification and also to count children with their guardians who are living doubled up as at risk of homelessness and provide appropriate services. Next slide, please. Now we're going to turn it over to Kate to test your knowledge.
Okay, everybody, we have another quiz. So please take the time to go ahead and answer this for us. To be at risk of homelessness under Category 1, an individual family must have an income that is at or below 30% of AMI. So, true or false, people? Okay, Justin. This one's a little tricky, so we're going to let HUD, someone from HUD give an answer for why it should be true or false.
The correct answer here is actually false.
Mm-hmm.
The trick word here is at or below. To qualify under Category 1 of the at-risk of homelessness definition, an individual or family must have an income that is below 30% of AMI. And that is statutory. And for those of you who administered HPRP assistance, remember this is very different from your HPRP program. So we tricked you. Next question, Kate.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, let's try this again and see if we can do better this time. So John is 9. He is homeless by the Department of Education's definition. He hasn't moved twice in the past 60 days. He's at risk of homelessness. True or false? We encourage everyone to answer. Okay, can we see what the poll says? True. Okay. Would someone from HUD like to answer this one?
Sure. You guys got it right this time. John is at risk of homelessness, and he qualifies under the third category of at risk of homelessness. And we assume that he's not homeless under our definition because he has not moved twice in the past 60 days. Had he moved twice in the past 60 days and his family had not had permanent housing and had met the other criteria for Category 3 that Susanna discussed, he would have been considered homeless. Another thing to note, if John is living with his parents because he qualifies under Category 3 of the at-risk of homelessness definition, his parents or his guardians would also qualify with him. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Susanna to talk to you a little bit about documenting homelessness and at-risk of homelessness.
Thank you, Brett. All right, next slide, please. As you know, documentation of an individual or family status as homeless has always been required. Now here's the neat part. The record-keeping requirements that are established in the ESG interim rule and homeless definition final rule are detailed, and they haven't been established before by HUD in a codified regulation. To assist recipients in maintaining adequate case files, the record-keeping requirements of the interim rule clarify the documentation that HUD deems acceptable as proof of homelessness and at risk of homelessness. As part of this webinar, we want to point out to you the sections in the rule that talk about the record-keeping requirements. They are listed here on the slide. As a reminder, this webinar will not cover the details of the record-keeping requirements for each criteria under the homeless and at-risk of homelessness definition. That would add at least another hour to our presentation today, and gosh, we already have a lot to cover. Today, we're just hoping to give you the big picture, to provide an overview of the range of acceptable documentation types that can be used. Stay tuned. A webinar discussing the documentation requirements will be scheduled for early 2012. Next slide, please. Given the variability of both applicant circumstances and assistance available under the various program components, it is important and required by regulations that program administrators create policies and procedures for assessment and record keeping. Local policies and procedures must reflect HUD's priority for obtaining evidence. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In order to mirror the regulations, your policies and procedures should also specify expectations related to due diligence, efforts made to obtain the preferred type of documentation. Some records related to due diligence include correspondences to third parties, such as copies of electronic or certified mail, fax transmittals, phone calls logged as notes in the case file, etc. Also, notes in the case file should reflect the outcome of due diligence efforts, especially related to obstacles encountered, including the inability of third parties to provide verification in the preferred format within a reasonable time frame, or the reluctance to respond to requests. Next slide, please. Let's do another quick slide check. I'm now on slide number 33. And the title of your slide should be Range of Documentation Types. Great. Let's jump right in then. General documentation standards in order of preference are listed on this slide. Written third party is verification in writing from a third party, for example, emergency shelter provider, street outreach provider, landlord, etc., either directly to intake staff or through the potential program participant is most preferred. Intake worker observations documentation may be provided on a standardized form created by programs and used across the COC for the purposes of collecting consistent information across all potential program participants. Otherwise, intake worker observations will include case file notes and observations, including photographs documenting the circumstances and living situation of the potential program participant. Self-declaration. An affidavit of housing status as reported by the potential program participant is allowable, but is generally only acceptable if written or verbal third-party verification cannot be obtained. Self-declaration of housing status, for example, eviction, should be rare except as it relates to emergency assistance and victim services. We will discuss this further on the next slide. Depending on the type of documentation used, written third-party, oral third-party, or self-declaration, HUD recognizes that verifying an individual or family's homeless status requires additional steps by housing and service providers and often requires a homeless individual or family to answer the same question more than once. So in an effort to alleviate some of this burden on both housing and service providers and potential program participants, HUD has established the record-keeping requirements to allow for the use of documentation that is already available. One example of already available documentation is discharge paperwork, which is used to verify a stay in an institution. Another example is certification or appropriate service transactions recorded in a homeless management information system, HMIS, or other database that meet certain standards. Records contained in an HMIS or comparable database used by victim service or legal service providers are acceptable evidence of third-party documentation and intake worker observations as long as the HMIS retains an auditable history of all entries, including the person who entered the data, the date of the entry, and any changes that are made, and prevents overrides or changes of the dates entries are made. Next slide, please. HUD recognizes that circumstances as well as the type of service or housing provided will affect the ability of intake workers to obtain some forms of documentation listed in the record-keeping requirements. The regulations explicitly recognize that HUD does not want the inability to obtain third-party documentation to prevent an individual or family from being immediately admitted to emergency shelter, receiving street outreach services, or being immediately admitted to shelter or receiving services provided by a victim service provider. The record-keeping requirements in the regulations also make specific provisions to documenting housing status of individuals or families fleeing domestic violence. Written third-party referral is required when the agency providing services is not a victim service provider and only if the safety of the individual or family would not be jeopardized. Additionally, the written referral or observation need only include the minimum amount of information necessary to document that the individual or family is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And now I'm going to turn it back to Anne to talk about income determination.
Great, thank you so much, Susanna. I'm going to talk a little bit about determining income. Hopefully this will be pretty familiar to those of you, especially those of you who are administering the HPRP program because it is very similar. However, I want to be clear on a couple of issues. In the programs that provide homeless services, that is the Supportive Housing Program, Shelter Plus Care, those of you who do emergency shelter or rapid rehousing programs, income is not an eligibility factor. It never has been, and it will continue to not be an eligibility factor. It is an eligibility factor for homelessness prevention programs funded under the ESG rule. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how you determine income and how you document it. The other reason our competitive grantees want to take a look at this is because this will help you to determine rent. If you are a rental assistance program, that is, if you're running a program that is currently called, Shelter Plus Care under the Shelter Plus Care regulations, you need to determine income not for eligibility purposes, but to figure out how much rent the program participant should be paying. So as we've already mentioned, actually I'm going to go ahead, some of you are saying that the sound is fluctuating, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to the headset.
Okay, hopefully this is better. As already mentioned, annual income must be determined and documented for a variety of reasons. Again, for continuum of care programs, income is not required for eligibility purposes.
income is only required to determine the program participant's portion of the rent or their occupancy charge. So it is the first criterion under the first category of the at-risk of homelessness definition. That is what we reviewed earlier at less than 30% area median income. So under the rapid, additionally, I just want to make one very quick note that under the rapid rehousing component of ESG, under the requirement for continued assistance, meaning that income must be verified at the annual recertification period, not to get into the program, but as you recertify rapid rehousing participants on an annual basis under ESG, you do have to take a look at their income to see if they still need the rapid rehousing services. As we developed the program regulations around income, it was determined that we should be determining income consistently with other programs that HUD administers. So we're using the 24 CFR Part 5, which is the Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher definition of income. And that is generally the Part 5 definition of annual income is the gross amount of income of all adult household members that is anticipated to be received during the coming 12-month period. So next I'm going to move to inclusions, exclusions, and treatment of assets. We've seen some questions already coming in around assets. Next slide, please. Great. These are the types of income that must be counted or included when calculating current gross income for eligibility purposes. First, and I'm going to highlight a few of them that I think are particularly important. The first bullet is earned income, and that includes earned income through wages or salaries, overtime pay, fees, tips, and bonuses, or other compensation, as well as self-employment or business income. So that's if somebody has a job or has their own business. Interest and dividend income and pension and retirement income is generally not something that we see a whole lot of. However, we do get quite a few questions in the HPRP program about how to treat those kinds of assets, which I will talk about in a moment. Of course, you need to look at unemployment and disability income, TANF or other types of public assistance, alimony, child support, or income from the armed services. Next slide, please. In terms of what you should exclude when looking at income, you should always exclude the income of children. That is, if one of the minor children has a job, that income should be excluded. Payments received for the care of foster children or foster adults should be excluded. Lump sum additions to family assets such as inheritances, insurance income, capital gains, and settlements should also be excluded. Medical expense reimbursement, the income of any live-in aides, certain types of state payments for disabilities, financial aid, and armed forces hostile fire pay should all be excluded. And just a note here, we are actually actively working on an income calculator that will help you make these determinations by using a tool that will be posted on the HRE. It won't be out for a couple of months, I think, but soon we will have something for you all to use as just a tool. The next question, so once you look at their income, their regular income, the next question is really how you treat assets. And assets are cash or material items that can be converted to cash quickly. That is, things that they own or have. They include both real or personal property and investments that a household may possess, including assets that are owned by more than one person, but allow unrestricted access to the potential program participant. When dealing with assets, please note that the Part 5 definition only addresses how assets should be dealt with for the purposes of calculating income. HUD has not established requirements for how assets are to be treated in determining whether the potential program participant household has the financial resources to address their housing need and what, if any, amount of assets held by the program participant household must be spent down in order to qualify for assistance. This is particularly important for ESG homelessness prevention programs, and we actually get quite a few questions about this under HPRP. It specifically comes up around the issue of retirement accounts, 401ks, 403bs, Roth IRAs, things that have value and could be liquidated but are really considered an asset. We also, I've seen a couple of questions come through on the help desk about if you own a house and those sorts of things, and they are also considered assets. Next slide, please. So just like what we've talked about earlier in terms of documentation types, this list should look fairly familiar. We would like to see written third-party documentation at intake, and that is something that's verifiable in writing. In most cases, what we see are check stubs, whether it's a check stub from a job or a check stub from Social Security or some other type of check stub. That's usually the type of written third-party documentation that we see. Oral third-party documentation is documentation from a third party, which could include an employer, the Social Security Administration, or TANF caseworker, that is provided by a third party over the telephone or in person directly to intake staff. So usually what would happen is verification, this kind of verification would be received by an intake worker if somebody comes in to see them, does not have a check stub available, but says, I work at Jim's Market. Then the caseworker could just call Jim's Market and verify the amount of income available. So that's something that is absolutely available to you all. I just want to note that caseworkers should document due diligence, and that is due diligence, which is the effort made to collect written third-party verification, should be documented in the case notes so that if a program is monitored, we can see that somebody actually tried to get documentation, either written or oral. And then the last case scenario, if nothing else works, then you could do a self-declaration, and that is an affidavit of income, or a self-certification is the language that we've used in the past, as reported by the potential program participant. It's allowable, but is generally really only acceptable if written or verbal third-party verification cannot be attained. Again, this is really the last resort in terms of verification methods. I want to pause here for a moment because this is something that has come up quite a bit over the last couple of weeks. In terms of the level of documentation, HUD expects that all recipients and subrecipients will make a conscientious and reasonable effort to use the highest standard of documentation possible. However, we also recognize that circumstances, as well as the type of service or housing provided, will affect the ability of intake workers to obtain the documentation required under this record-keeping section of the final and interim rules. As we already described, under the discussion related to housing status, acceptable documentation standards may be dependent on the circumstances of the potential program participant and the type of assistance provided. So again, regardless of the circumstances and types of assistance, we do encourage intake staff to document due diligence efforts and to include that kind of documentation, such as the number of phone calls they logged, their case notes, copies of electronic or certified mail, faxes, that sort of thing, in the case file, so that we can see that due diligence has been a standard in that particular agency. Next slide, please. So this is a fairly simple slide, and those of you who have been running programs either through the ESG, HPRP, or the Continuum of Care programs, I'm sure that you know how to do this. You calculate income by annualizing hourly, weekly, or monthly payments as appropriate. So if you are working with somebody who has an hourly wage, you multiply that wage by the number of hours worked per week and multiply that by 52 weeks to annualize it. You then compare that against the area median income, or AMI. Those standards are posted on HUD's website as well as the HPRP, as well as the HRE. and then you keep that documentation in the case file. So hopefully this wasn't too daunting. It is something that shouldn't look too different for most of you who are already running our programs and who either charge rent or are running a homelessness prevention program. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brett, who is going to do the next section.
Thank you, Anne. And for the final portion of our presentation today, we're going to look through the definition of disability as well as documenting disability when it's needed. Next slide, please. To be eligible for a shelter plus care program and also for a permanent supportive housing program, a person must be both homeless and disabled. The SHP program may serve homeless persons with a qualifying disability and their households. There are 3 types of disability as defined in the final rule related to defining homelessness that will define a person as disabled. The first is having a physical, mental, or emotional impairment, including an impairment that's caused by alcohol or drug abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, or a brain injury. The second is having a developmental disability, and the third is having HIV or AIDS. We're going to walk through each of these criteria over the next few slides. Next slide, please. Under the first criteria of the disability definition, which is a physical, mental, or emotional condition that includes impairment caused by alcohol or drug abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, or brain injury. The physical, mental, or emotional condition must first be long-continuing or of indefinite duration, must second substantially impede an individual's ability to live independently, and third, could be improved by the provision of more suitable housing conditions. Record-keeping requirements, which we will discuss a little bit later, have been developed to help program administrators determine whether a physical, mental, or emotional impairment meets these criteria. Next slide, please. And all of this should look fairly familiar to you, but a developmental disability is defined in Section 102 of the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill or Rights Act of 2000. This means that it's a developmental disability that is severe, chronic disability that is attributable to mental or physical impairment or a combination of the two. This disability must be manifested before the age of 22, must be likely to continue indefinitely, and next slide, please, must substantially limit 3 or more major life activities that are listed on this slide. And the next slide, please. It must require a combination and sequence of special interdisciplinary or generic services, individualized supports, or other forms of assistance that are of lifelong or extended duration and are individually planned or coordinated. That is all the second criteria. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that an individual may be considered to have a developmental disability if they are diagnosed from birth to age 9 as having substantial developmental delays or specific congenital or acquired condition without having met 3 or more of the criteria that we discussed on the last slide, so long as they have a high probability of meeting these criteria later in life. Next slide, please. The final way you can qualify as having a disability includes having HIV or AIDS. Next slide, please. Recipients and subrecipients must have written documentation in their project files that qualifies each participant as having met the program definition of disabled when it is required for eligibility to a program. And in this instance, written third-party verification is the only way that you can obtain verification of disability status. Written third-party verification includes a written verification from a licensed professional, a check from the Social Security Administration, or that they meet the Social Security Administration's definition of disability, or the receipt of a disability check. Next slide, please. We have recognized that in our current programs, it's sometimes difficult to obtain a written diagnosis of disability up front. Therefore, where disability is required for admission to a program, an intake staff observation may be taken when the person presents for assistance, so long as the disability is confirmed and accompanied by written third-party verification no later than 45 days after the person presents for assistance. Again, oral third-party and self-certification is not an appropriate form of documentation for disability. And that's pretty much it for disability. It all looks fairly similar to what we have now. I'm going to turn it back over to Anne for a little bit to go over some of the questions that we've been receiving, and then we will close out the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett. I apologize that Mike Rowenhouse is not on our webinar today. He would usually, at this point in the webinar, lighten things up with some sort of a song or joke, and I'm just not as witty or talented as Mike Rowenhouse, so we won't be doing that today. Maybe next time we'll get him on to sing for us. As we move forward, I wanted to clarify a couple of things based on some of the questions that we are seeing come through the webinar question process. That didn't sound very good, but in any case, I wanted to talk a little bit about the applicability of the definition to certain programs. I know some of you logged in maybe a couple of minutes late and didn't quite hear what I said or wanted some additional clarification. So the new definition of homelessness rule applies, or it takes effect on January 4th. However, it applies differently depending on whether you are funded under the ESG program, that is a formula program, or under the competitive program. On January 4th, both the new ESG rule and the homeless definition rule apply to the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. So if a certain jurisdiction received additional money under the ESG program for 2011, this rule will apply to them. However, on the competitive side, because your grant agreements actually have the original SHP, Shelter Plus Care, or SRO regulations attached to them and are therefore incorporated into your grant agreement, these rules only apply as projects get renewed. So for example, I said earlier that the renewals that we announced earlier today will have this definition apply to them. However, what I didn't say was that it will apply at the point you go to your new grant agreement, because currently, if your grant agreement is currently in place, it has the old rules attached to it. That's how competitive projects are funded. So if, let's say, the project that was announced today, Jane's House, has a program year of September 1st to August, to the end of August, the new definition does not actually take effect for your program until the beginning of September, when your new grant agreement is in place. So I hope that that's fairly clear for folks now. Most of you do have some time to get used to these new requirements because for the most part, grantees don't have grant agreements that take effect at the beginning of January. There are a few of you, but for the most part, many folks don't have renewals that start until March or later. Brett, did I get that okay? Okay. The next thing that we see coming through as a question that we wanted to talk about is Category 1 of the homeless definition, and we have some questions coming through about transitional housing. So transitional housing is included as part of Category 1 of the homeless definition. That is, if you are on the streets or shelters place is not meant for human habitation or transitional housing, then you are included as homeless. However, it's excluded from the part, if you're exiting an institution where you have resided for less than 90 days, what Susanna said specifically was that unless they are coming from a transitional, if they're coming from a transitional housing project, they are not considered homeless under Category 1, even if they resided there less than 90 days. And that is because in many cases, transitional housing programs and permanent housing programs funded under the SHP program and the Shelter Plus Care program are allowed to hold units up to 90 days for people who have a temporary institutionalization. That is, somebody can go into a mental health institution or can be briefly in jail, and their unit will be held for them. So that's why we decided that in the case of the institution part of the Category 1, they must have lived on the streets or in shelter prior to entry to qualify as Category 1. Brett, did you want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing I would add to that is that we do intend to follow this policy through in the COC program rule when you all are able to see it. So this is not a policy that we intend to change, which is another reason we omitted transitional housing from that portion of Category 1.
Fair enough. Is there anything else that we should talk about before we turn it back over to Kate? Okay, Kate, I think we've wrapped up the content portion of the slides. If you want to wrap us up.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anne. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's the HRE. Recipients should be familiar with the HUD HRE depicted here. This is where you will find the latest information from HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs. You can also submit questions to HUD and request technical assistance through the HUD HRE. Next slide, please. A number of resources are being posted on the HUD HRE for you to use in determining eligibility and documentation of potential participants. Next slide, please. HUD is working to produce a number of user guides highlighting key changes in the new ESG regulation and will alert communities when these anticipated resources become available. In addition to the user guides, we anticipate that the HUD HRE will provide a range of additional resources. We will alert communities when these resources become available. Next slide, please. There are a number of additional webinars related to the Emergency Solutions Grants Program over the next few weeks. As usual, all of these webinars will be posted on the HUD HRE website for convenient access. Next slide, please. We have gone through the criteria under the homeless and at-risk of homelessness definitions. The income definition, including what is included and excluded when determining income, and we also reviewed the criteria under the disability definition, and finally, the documentation standards for housing status, income, and disability. We hope that the materials here have been helpful and that you are ready to learn more about many of the topics touched through our upcoming webinars and the materials to be posted soon on the HRE. Please take a few minutes to complete the online survey to let us know how well this webinar achieved its objectives. We will use your feedback to help improve future webinars. We thank you. If this is your second time to come to this webinar, thank you very much for your patience and for joining us. And we hope that everyone has the rest of their day. It's a really good one. That was Bye.